So this week, here in the Kolel, there was the Kolel Maisis. So there was exciting discussion about halacha l'maisa. What was the question? The question was bugs in the water. Someone finally got around to taking the cup of water, looking at the water, and lo and behold, he found what by all appearances appeared to be a bug. So now the shaila is, this brought the old question back, the old controversy. It's almost 20 years old. Tafshin Samach Daled Barach 2004. So it brought this question back in a very practical way. For most people, before 2004, maybe for many people even afterwards, it feels abstract because the average person doesn't really notice anything in the water. But then, and now here in the Kolel as well, there are those that say that if you're looking and you know what you're looking for, and you can actually pretty much see it, then it's not a myth. It's not one of those mythical creatures. You can actually see it. Right? So, what we saw was it was essentially a small white thing, but if you magnify it, then you know, you've seen other pictures of what it looks like magnified, so you realize that it's essentially the same thing. So among Chabad Rabbanim, when this question came up, so there are two Rabbanim that wrote, or at least two that wrote Barichas here in Crown Heights. There are two that wrote Barichas Kontresim to be mater. So that's Rabbi Heller, who published his Kuntris in the Ur Yisrael journal. Kama, and then again, and Senator Azdaba also wrote a kuntris, although I think it was just published as a booklet at the time. I think it's harder to get a hold of right now. On the other hand, you have two other Rabbanim here in Crown Heights that Taka Aserd, although as far as I know, neither of them ever wrote anything at length, ever really got into it and explained their justification. Seems more like they were expressing the fact that they are signing on to what all the other Rabbanim from other neighborhoods are saying, l'isr. And overall, it seems that in most of the Frum worlds, the Haredi, so-called Haredi worlds, it's been accepted that you have to filter the water, you can't drink tap water, whereas in Crown Heights, it sort of depends which Rav you follow. So in this shiur, I would like to present and give a bit of an intro, an overview, whatever you want to call it, into the issues involved here. And as a basis, I was using what Rav Heller wrote, and as I just said, the direction he's heading in is more lakula, but I will quote from others as well to provide a certain balance. And beyond the specific discussion about water, there are a lot of important general basic yesaitis here relating to bugs in general, and what exactly does it mean when we say a bug that's asr al pitayna. So it's important to at least familiarize ourselves with these inyanim. And the discussion really divides itself into a number of categories, a number of sub-discussions, and we'll try to tackle them one by one. So the first question is, the most obvious question, which we're going to focus on now, is, okay, let's say there's something here. There's something in the water, and that something is, by most definitions, what we call a sheretz. But al pi halacha, what is the gather of a sheretz al pi halacha, specifically in terms of size? How big does something have to be for halacha to recognize it as a sheretz? Let's start from menakal al-kaver. Let's start with the most obvious case. Let's say it's completely invisible to the naked eye. Right? So I'm sure most or all assume and know that we don't pay attention to microscopic things. But let's just not let it pass. Let's actually take a look. Where does this idea come from? Where does this idea that we ignore microscopic things, where does that emerge from? Right? So we all know that Torah doesn't pay attention. But there's no early makar for this. Why is there no early makar for this? Because the early makaris didn't take into account things that are microscopic, to the extent that they didn't even talk about it, address it, discuss it, say that we don't care. It's just not there. Only the last few hundred years, so that's when scientists or pre-scientists started inventing devices for magnification. So, for example, the microscope, it was invented in the 1600s. And once that was invented, so then it was just a matter of time. Of course, things were slower back then. But as the decades went on, people started turning the microscope on different objects around them and started noticing different things that had never been noticed before. Now, when did this start affecting? When did this reach the world of halacha discussions? So there's a very interesting sefer called Sefer Habris. What is the Sefer Habris? So the Sefer Habris is written by someone by the name of Rav Pinchas Eliyahu Horovitz. He passed away in Poland in Tufkov Peyal of 1821, so around the time of the Mittel Rebbe. And he was Mechaber the Sefer, which is a Torah Sefer, but it's extremely, basically called eclectic. Munah, halacha, Musar, Kabbalah, science, philosophy, technology, all kinds of stuff going on in the Sefer, very unusual Sefer. So he printed it first in 1797 anonymously, and became a bestseller immediately, and then he printed an expanded edition in 1807, and I guess maybe that's when he put his name on it. At some point, it became clear that he was the author. So in the first section of Sefer Habris, this first section is called Ksav Yosher. So there's 18 chapters that go through nature, explaining nature. Elements, whatever as they were understood at the time. And he goes through all the fields of science: astronomy, geography, botany, zoology, physics, anatomy, medicine, music. He has something to say about all of that. He even sometimes goes off into new technological inventions. He'll explain how certain new machines, certain new devices work. He speaks about vaccines, one of the earliest firms to mention the cowpox vaccine, which we already discussed in the past. And it's a mixture. He's quoting Svarim, but he's also quoting more recent discoveries, advances in science, and he has to sort of thread his way, especially in cases where it seems to be a stira. So he has his way of how he works it all out. So, very interesting personality. He essentially imported into the Torah world, the world of Svarim. He imported a lot of up-to-date scientific information, but it wasn't coming from a direction of Haskalah. That wasn't his agenda, but a totally different and unique perspective. And in fact, the rest of the Sefer is all about Yiras Hashem, Avodas Hashem, his shittas and Avodas Hashem. And the Sefer overall was very much accepted in the frum world and was very influential. Just now, Heichal Abesht, someone wrote an article pointing out the influence of the Sefer on the Torahs of Reb Nachman of Breslov. There are different places where he makes observations about the world around him. And someone went through them and realized that there's a lot of parallels between Sefer Habris, and which makes sense. That was, if you're a little more curious and interested in things like this, that would be a Sefer you would look at. So in Sefer Habris, back to microscopes, in Sefer Habris, Chelik Aleph, which is called Ksav Yosher, and Maimer Vav, which is called Mayna Be'esh, in Perek Gimel, we find the following comment. He says, I was already speaking about vinegar, and he was just speaking about it in a more scientific context. He says, I want to make a comment to the reader. You have to know that all chametz yayin, chametz shecher, or whichever liquid fluid the chametz is derived from, it's male teiloim ktanim bedakim ha'ed. It's actually full of small teiloim, and you won't see it by looking at it. But, he says, if you put it in a clean jar and you put it on the window where the sun is shining, then you could see it b'chush, b'ayin yafa. You won't need any magnification. And you'll see all around the edge on the top, teiloim rabim ha'ed, that are, you can see they're mamash yisneu v'yarutzu ana v'ana k'dgei hayam. They're not static. There's a lot of movement going on there. And he says, why is that? So the way he explains it, the way he understands it is that vinegar, by definition, the way he understood it at least, is it's sort of molding, it's apesh. So if there's ipush, so automatically there's teiloim. And he says it wouldn't help to filter it, to run it through cloth. Because if the vinegar is going through, that means the teiloim are also going through. The vinegar and the teiloim are essentially one and the same. He's using flowery language, but they go together. So he says, therefore, if you put the vinegar on something, so he doesn't spell out the halacha, but the halacha would be that in the vinegar itself it might be fine. But once you put it on the food, he assumes that it's parush, that it already separated from the source. So now it became a sheretz hashayretz, so you would have a problem. And of course, this is going to be a very important topic here. When a sheretz is born in a certain place, and when does it start having a din of sheretz? But this idea that in many cases it doesn't have that din until it actually is parush. So he concludes, Lachein leisoichal olav chaymetz, until you cook the chaymetz, so that way you kill all the telah. Now, what's he talking about? What do we know about this today? So if you look it up, you'll find different articles. I don't take responsibility for all the science here, but the way it's explained is, the way it's understood today is that in the vinegar, naturally produced vinegar, you'll have something called the vinegar eel. Now, an eel, of course, is a much bigger creature. These are not actually eels, but they're tiny and they remind you of the eel, so that's how they got their nickname, the vinegar eel. And it explains that vinegar is acetic acid and water, and during the fermentation process, these vinegar eels, which are really worms called nematodes, they feed on the live bacteria and the yeast culture that's there in the vinegar. So it doesn't sound like it's mamash a direct, not that I looked into it, it doesn't sound like it's as a direct result the way the Sefer Bris made it sound, but they definitely show up. So you can find them in unfiltered vinegar. They're about 1/16 of an inch, 2 millimeters. And you say apple cider vinegar would be a particularly good example of where you could see these if you wanted to. You can do an experiment and you can actually see them show up. These were discovered in 1656 by a fellow by the name of Pierre Borel. And of course, nowadays, you look it up, even though they're harmless, but United States law is such that you cannot sell vinegar that contains these vinegar eels. So you have to filter and pasteurize it, boil it. So you make sure that way you destroy the bacteria and the yeast culture, and thereby you also destroy these creatures that thrive off of that. Now, if you go getting back to the Sefer Bris, he didn't actually spell out quite clearly that there's a microscope involved, but if you look up Pierre Borel, you'll see that was literally Pierre Borel's whole thing. He just went around with a microscope and looked at things, and then he wrote about it. And he wrote a book called in Latin, basically a century of microscopic observations. And he just literally went around and looked at stuff, described what he saw. And I've seen it said that that's where he describes his discovery of the insects in vinegar. In fact, it's also said that he looked at blood and he saw what he thought were worms in the blood. And then a couple of years later, they figured out that those are actually the blood cells. So that's how blood cells are discovered in the blood. So that's where this information came from. In the 1600s, for the first time, someone with a microscope saw these creatures. Turns out in that case he was correct. Till today, we recognize that those are, in fact, little shrotzim. And the Sefer Bris is basing himself on this information, and he's adding that there actually is a way to see it with your naked eye if you put it in a certain place. So he's the one introducing this new information, this revelation, and coming to some halachic conclusions. So the famous response to the Sefer Bris is in the Binas Adam, right? So the Binas Adam is...
Why would I have to cook it? If you have little bugs in it, you just have to cook the little dead bugs.
Well, I think in this case, you're boiling it and you're filtering it. But let's not go off into that whole topic of when it's within before it was Peidish. Maybe we'll get to that in another part. So the famous response to this is from the Binas Adam. Right, he said clearly, boil it and then filter it. So that's the... This is Tavashal Tchila, then Tisanin. If you're Masanin first, it's not going to help. You boil it, then you can do masan. So the famous response comes from the Binas Adam. The Binas Adam is, of course, the Chai Adam. The Chai Adam is an Chayim, and then there's the Iyunim, or it's called Nishmas Adam, and then in Yeridei, it's called Chachmas Adam, and the Iyunim are in the Binas Adam. I already mentioned the Binas Adam last year in a Shiur about Tefillah B'Tziver, that the Binas Adam, he quotes the Nevi Nechemia quotes the Binas Adam as saying that an Avul could go to Shul to hear Kaddish and Kedushim. The Nevi Nechemia was disagreeing with him, and that came down to what the gather of Tefillah B'Tziver was. So anyway, a lot of people point to the Binas Adam as the first source, pushing back and saying we don't rely on microscopes. So if you look at the Binas Adam, we'll see it's not quite exactly how he said it. So in the Binas Adam Misr V'Heter Klal Amadal, he says, what's the story with the Chaimitz? Shekasav Chayker Echad B'Sifrei Sefer HaBris, that it's turned out in this butter that you can't have Chaimitz without Teilaim. And the way he paraphrases it is Hamistakel B'Schuches Shekoiden microscope. So you'll see that the Chaimitz is full of Teilaim, and he wrote, therefore not to have Chaimitz, even if you filter it's not enough. Even if the bag of dak moed, and the only solution is to first boil it and then to filter it. So Binas Adam responds and says, Tshuva, what he says, Mashakasav lesser chaymetz hevelhu, ridiculous. Because the Torah says, with a Nazir, chaymetz yayin, the Nazir can't have chaymetz. So the Torah is pretty much saying, let everyone else can have chaymetz. And it says in Rosh, the tevalt pitech b'chaymetz. Part of the conversation, part of the dialogue is to dip the bread in the vinegar. Now, why would the Torah not spell out if stam chaymetz is a problem? Why would the Torah not say anything? Why shouldn't it say? It should have said chaymetz mevushal, or maybe not the Torah. We should have had a tradition for thousands of years that you always have to boil the vinegar. Okay, so he has a general argument. Can't be if the Torah said it's fine. Okay. And then he adds something interesting. He says, and you can't say that he means that there are teiloim b'koyach in the chaymetz, is potential teiloim. So if that's the problem, I'll explain in a second what he probably means. If that's the problem, then we shouldn't eat eggs either, because the Sefer HaBris writes that if you zoom in, if you might look at the Zer HaAdam under a microscope, you'll see many people. This is a belief, a concept that's mentioned in a lot of Sfarim and books for that period of time, that supposedly if you look inside, I think also, he doesn't mention, but you look inside a seed, you see the fruit, you look inside the zara, you see the person. He mentions you look inside the egg, you'll see a chicken, mamish, zoom in. So why, we shouldn't eat eggs anymore, because there's really a little chicken inside the egg, a microscopic chicken. So the same way we don't say that for eggs, we shouldn't say that for the teiloim b'koyach in the chaymetz. So it's nonsense. The Torah only answered what's b'koyach. No, did not answer what's b'koyach, only what's b'poyel. Now what's he talking about? Why is he talking about b'koyach and b'poyel? So I think that was how he was trying to grasp and comprehend what a microscope is and what the microscope is showing. And it seems that the Chai Adam couldn't imagine that there are actually little at this Metzias, that there's tiny bruim that you can't see. His understanding probably was that things only exist on the plane of what we're able to see. Once you're zooming in that much, so that reminded him of the person, the Bezer Adam, or the chicken microscopically in the egg. So if you're telling me you're seeing teiloim in the microscope in the vinegar, that's the same category. That's also teiloim b'koyach that you're seeing. So bazay the Torah didn't answer teiloim b'koyach. So he's responding, but in Lefi his Havana. So that can't be it. And he says, but he did say that you're able to see it in the sun. So Binas Adam essentially has the same conclusion that we have. It has to be something you can see. Okay, Sefer HaBris said you could see it. So he says, okay, fine, if you could see it, that's already a din in Shulchan Aruch. Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef already brings from Yereni Yeruchim, Chaymetz sheyesh bei teiloim. So starts off in the Chaymetz, it's still fine. Now the question is, Pirshu, once they leave the vinegar, what's the halachic definition of Pirshu? There's different levels you could think of. So in Pirshu la'aver, Beis Yosef brings from Yereni Yeruchim, if they went into the air, that's Pirshu. But min ha'chaymetz l'tavshil, that's still not Pirshu. And he gets into this barichas. So the Sefer HaBris said that the second you put it in a dish, that's already Pirshu. The Binas Adam is responding and saying, this din is a befedish adena Yosef. And it says there's a whole discussion. And basically the maskana is that it has to literally leave it all together and go out into the open air. But not if it's being transferred from food to food. Shouldn't be a problem. Gets into that barichas. And he concludes After we're Mavar the Menatayra, as long as it wasn't Peirush Legamre, which means Chutz Lekli, that's his definition that it's mutter, and that was what he was trying to prove, that it has to be Chutz Lekli. So seeing it in the sun, it could be has a din sharetz down the road, but right now in the chaymetz, it still doesn't have a din sharetz that's aser. So what's the only problem now? The only problem now is that if you could see it, if you could look at it and you see the looks like shratzim, then in the rabbanan you're not allowed to eat it because of baal teshaktu. Totally different issue, nothing to do with shratzim. But b'chlal, you're not allowed to eat disgusting things. So if it looks disgusting, if you're able to see the bugs, even if al pi halacha they weren't peirush and it's not a din sharetz, it's still baal teshaktu. So he says, in this case, that's not a problem either. Because baal teshaktu is only if you could taka see it. And the way we explain is that you have to put it on the windowsill to see it. So that means that in an ordinary situation, you take the chaymetz and you put it in your foods, you're never going to see it. If you're never going to see it, there's no baal teshaktu either. There's no sharet, there's no baal teshaktu. You're good to go. And there's a Gemara. Ravina said about the fish, about the worms in the fish, that just serve it to me in a way where I don't see it and I can swallow it without seeing it, and whatever you don't know doesn't hurt you. Right? Now she says, if I see them, I'll be disgusted. If I don't see them, I won't be disgusted. And then the Bina Satan conclusion says, no one ever said anything, even use vinegar in their food and they don't check. He says, in fact, the opposite. You should be nizar not to filter it. Because if you filter it, that might be considered pirush. Because maybe it was pirush for chazar. I mean, it's hard to really separate it, but could be for a moment there it went out, it went back in. So better not to filter it, and the best with that, minig yisrael tidy. That was the Binas Adam's response. So we see that his conclusion was the opposite. So this first shayla that came up of being chayshish to microscopic, he said not to. But I wouldn't say, it doesn't seem quite like he had a fully articulated explanation, idea about why we should ignore things that are microscopic. And then I noticed after I went through this, I noticed another article, so most people just quote the Binas Adam. I saw someone point out that, hey, it doesn't really seem like he's saying quite what he's being made out to say. Some also point to another very relatively early makar, and that's a sefer called Ma'ori Ur by Aaron Verms. He was the Mamala Makam of the Shagas Arya and Mitz. Now, some people say we shouldn't quote Rabbi Aaron Worms because maybe he started off Orthodox, but by the time he was finished, maybe at that point, France and Germany were really sort of going off the deep end where Frumkeit is concerned. Someone actually wrote an entire article in Yerush Hasenu, Volume 3, a whole article about the attitude to Rabbi Aaron Worms, and his maskana there is that it's all a mistake, misunderstanding, he's fine. Okay, so in the Ma'arei Ur, Tafkuf Tzadik Aleph, in the section called Kan Tahar, so on Chulin, so he has a comment there, he writes, you can only see Nidam Rak B'Kli Habata. So here's being a little more direct, these are things you can only see with some kind of magnification. So we have to say, Shaloi Chashashu Chachamim, because the vart is that they only can, his understanding is they can only exist in here. So in Mela, there's never a chashash parish. Because the only way these things, these tiny little things, can survive is from the chaymetz v'kamech shesvivoi. So the second, it loses that, it's ice barrier, it dies, it can't be rechesh, it never has its own independent existence. But if they are visible, he says, then you're going to have a problem, and he goes off to discuss that. And again, it seems to not be quite what we're saying, what we understand. He's not saying, So he seems to be saying that it never has its own independent mitzias as a sheretz. The gather of a sheretz is that at some point, if you separate it, it can exist. If it never exists separately, so apparently he's saying that never quite got the identity of a sheretz. So he's not saying that al pi halacha they be'etzim don't have chshivas. It seems like a technical thing. His understanding is that they can't really exist on their own. That's also not correct. Comes right there from, when you think about it, you just assume that anything that is large enough to be visible, that is able to go out and survive. It's so tiny, it just seems like it's so, it doesn't have its own kaya. That's not how it works. But you see, each one in their own way is trying to explain why we should ignore it. The first one to express it in the way we know it today is l'chayra Shlomo Kluger. So Shlomo Kluger is a tshuva printed in Shas Tshuvas Tuv Tam B'das, Adura Tinyana, Kuntras Achin Simon Gimel. So he's talking about certain grain and certain bugs. And the question was, someone thought maybe we should first grind them and then take a magnifying glass, and then we'll see if there's anything inside. And he says, Rabbi Emden suggested this. So grind them, it'll be harder, I guess it'll be harder to look at it before you grind it. It's hard to figure out what's going on. So first grind it, then you have, it's packed tightly together. Then you take a magnifying glass and you see if it's there, if it's not there. That was what someone suggested. So he says, Chas lahaskir, because and you shouldn't make a svek. You're putting it in the grinder, you don't know whether what you see when it comes out is the same as what came in. He gets into that as to why he thinks that would be a case of when you do say that you can go about your business and then check, and when you don't say that. Basically, he says in this case, it's clear the only reason why you're doing this is because you want to check for the bugs. So that's your whole kavanah, so that's considered which you shouldn't do. And then he says about the checking with the glass, b'shem the Yaakov Emden, ein nidali klal. The bedika leishayach rak b'med de'efshir habedika l'chol adam. Bedika by definition is something that every person should be able to do. Av b'med i'efshir rak b'derech rachik hayedei kli zeh le'nechshir bedika l'hatrakach. Maybe part of this is informed by how common it was to have a magnifying glass in those days. Obviously today, anyone could buy any device they want, but back then, part of what he's saying is that anyone can check the regular way. This is a derech rachik. You're going to check with a magnifying glass. So inachshav bedika leheter, that would not work lekula. And he says it's not just. I'm not just that I'm saying that it doesn't work lekula. The raya is that otherwise we should also be machmir. He says, for example, the mumchim say that if you look at water under a schochis, we'll see bugs in the water. And if you look at a sakin shel shchita, the shchita knife, which is supposed to be smooth without any bumps, but you look at it under magnifying glass, you'll see many bumps. It's not perfectly smooth. You look at it under magnification. And of course, this is something we never cared about, and never looked into, never concerned us. So bar karchach that it's not a re'iyah lahachmer. It's not a re'iyah lahachmer. Mikol shekain that it's not a re'iyah lahakol. He says also another area, maybe with sirchas, shchita. Maybe we should start looking at sirchas under a magnifying glass to see if there's a hole. Clearly, that's not part of halacha. We don't use this in halacha when we need to check something, or when we need to know that something appears to be complete, etc. So that's how he expressed it. After him, around the same time, Chuvas Maram Shik, also about water. So he says, on the one hand, if there's a miyat hamatzui, you're supposed to, which is its own discussion, if there's a miyat hamatzui, you're supposed to check. On the other hand, water, from the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, seems like it's not matzui lahasliya. Why? Because the whole discussion is whether you can drink water at night from here, from there. Maybe there's an aluka. In the water, it doesn't sound like there's any filtering involved there. But that's not a conclusive raya, because different places could be different, and there probably are wells which are wormier. So this is what he says: if you're drinking by day, and in a cup where you can you can look, you can see, and you'll be able to see whether there's something there or not. So if you don't see, you don't have to keep on checking. Maybe there's a Tyler she'ein in it. So he trots out this line that's not from Malachi Asharis. You're supposed to look with your own eye. So if you're just looking at it, taking a glimpse at it should be enough, and you don't need to filter. So Medina, you don't have to, and that's what most people do. But still, Mishum Zehiris, already back then, the Yirei Hashem used to filter. Chalila, though, to say that whoever is not is an Avarian, that's not, and this is, of course, negaya to the question we have today. And especially by Riches we have from the Aruch HaShulchan and Yerdei Simon Pedal, which is where these inyanim are discussed. First, he quotes the Chachmas Adam that said that it's a problem to filter the chaymetz because maybe that's dafka, you're causing it to be pirish. He disagrees with that. He says there's no early makar that says to be careful. You have to filter, not to filter. It sounds like filtering is always good. So it must be that we're not going to start being concerned about something that we can't see. We don't know if the filter is making it being Peirush v'chayzer, so don't assume. And then he says, I saw the one who quoted the Chachmi Ateva about the magnifying glass and the Chaimetz and the Teilayim. So first of all, it's Talush, right? So if it's Mechuber, so then the Sheretz right away is a problem. If it's Talush, so it's not a Sheretz, it's Al-Aretz until it's Peirush. That's where the terminology of Peirush comes from. So the vinegar itself, right away, not a problem. Then I heard that chalal and water, right, especially in rainwater, there's full of bruim dakim that no one can see. And when I was a kid, I heard from someone who was far away, and he saw a magnifying glass or a microscope that magnified it tens of thousands of times, and he saw all the creatures in the water. That was, I guess, the best information he was able to get, but that's what he heard. So, how could we drink water? They were seemingly here all along. But it says, "I'm mesud like osra toida b'mash she'ena ayin shalatas boy." It's like nitna toida l'malachim. If not, the chaykim say that the air is also full of bruim dakim and adakim. And when you open your mouth, he's the one who brings this line. You open your mouth, you're swallowing them. So first he says, "Alavadai dehavel yiftzapiyah," which maybe is a play on words with the mouth. But first it sounds like he doesn't believe them. Afim kainu. If you don't see it, not a problem. But whatever you could see. Afilu neged hashemesh, afilu dak min hadak. That's as long as you could see it. It should be yesharetz gomer. That's why he continues. You have to be careful, taka, with water from the ground, because then there could be zvuvim ktanim, teilayim ktanim. Then it's a problem. That's why you have to filter the water. And there are many other achreinim who wrote.
The filter, you said the thing's not a problem because it's in Polish, not Yiddish.
Right. Water generally should be fine, but if you know there's a well that's infested, so then you have to filter.
What is the danger of seeing? Is that you can see?
That we're getting to next. Yeah. So we're starting with the basics of things you can't see at all, and then we'll get to the thornier questions of things that you can somewhat see. So many others wrote along these lines. It can't be matter fish, where the scales are only seen under a magnifying glass. Holes in the urea, as we mentioned, bumps on the knife, something on the esrig. Psul and the Sefer Torah. These are all different shuvas that have been written in the last 100, 200 years, and each one, in their own way, essentially says, or at least most say, in most cases, that we don't take that into account, and it's even related to killing the lice on Shabbos, because the famous kasha is, the Gemara says that they don't reproduce, and seemingly science says that we can see that they do reproduce. So some of the achreidim today want to explain that ha'gufa, this process of reproduction only takes place on a more microscopic level. So mebchinas ha'torah, it's as if that process doesn't count, and whatever we see is that they just seem to just appear without any preservative. So that is also using that same idea. So again, this is all fairly pashut. I just wanted to expand on that a bit. Now we get to the main question. Assuming that you have to see something, what does it mean to see it? If it's a tiny black dot where you can see absolutely no detail, is that already considered seeing? Or do you have to literally see the shape of a bug and say, oh, that looks like a bug? So if you start looking into this question, that's when all agreement starts breaking down already from this question. So if you look, for example, in Ur Yisrael, issue Lamed Vav, which was from Tafshin Samach Dalet, in the same issue you have 10 articles about shaitels, and then you have 4 articles about the bugs in the water. It was a confluence. They all came in at the same time. For those who remember. So that's when most of those who wrote about it, they wrote about it right away. Rav Heller wrote about it 2 years later in Samach Vav, and then again in Tafshin Ayin Beis in Madura Basra. So the same Rav Chaim Oberlander we quoted in the last year about websites on Shabbos. Rav Chaim Oberlander is also one of those who wrote there about the water. So this is the way he presents this issue. He says, often you have tiny dot, looks like dirt, but with a magnifying glass you see that it's a bug. So B'dikas Hamas and Kilchasa, Rabbi, who's notorious for being the biggest machmir and everything bug-related, so he quotes Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that that's still considered visible. That's the stance he takes, all the way on that end of the spectrum. The Oberlander responds and says, to me that seems like a chiddush. Part of the Nitna Torah L'Malachi Asharis means that 500 years ago, when they didn't have magnifying glasses, no one could ever have had any way of knowing what this dot really is. So they would have eaten it, and they wouldn't be chayshish. So now all of a sudden we were being chayshish for the same thing they weren't chayshish for, because we have this magnifying glass. The Maisa, a person can't see it. So if you look at Shmei Shabbos Kol Chasa, this is the way it quotes Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It's a bit different. It says, regarding the aphids on the citrus fruits, heard from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, first he said, if you can't see the chayos, you can't see the rechisha, you can't see bug-like behavior, something that looks like a bug is in action. That's not sheretz hashayretz alaretz, because we describe a sheretz hashayretz, so the shritza is part of it. Then he's been to the Chachma Sa'ad Bina Sa'ad Amarach HaShulchan. But then, after a while, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach changed his mind. Why? Because first he heard from the Mekaravim of the Chazon Ish that he was chayshish for these aphids on the citrus fruits. And then he heard after a while a hesber, that in these aphids gufa, there's different stages in the aphid's life. And at some stage, maybe an earlier stage, you would be able to see them moving around a little bit if you looked at it. So, seems like Shlomo Zalman really agrees in principle that if your naked eye can't see that it's rechishas hasheretz, it's fine. What's the story with those aphids? So that's, even if you can see that it's a bug, or maybe you don't see the rechisha, because part of the din is that it has to move like a bug. Kol shekain, if you wouldn't occur to you that it's a sheretz, all you see is a dot, it should be mutter. Then he quotes the Shut Shevet HaLevi, which is like a big source in this discussion. The Shevet HaLevi, Chelik Zayin, Simkuf Chav Beis, was matir, and he wrote, the Kudas Ka'elu Nidim La'alofim, Al Pri, Ubamayim. You can see on Paris and in water, thousands of dots. And there's no difference between these dots and regular dots that are not shrotzim. So Bazai, what you're seeing with your eye is not causing the problem. It's only what you're seeing through the glass that's causing the problem. If that's what's going on here, then there's no isser. And then Rav Oberlander actually brings in this vart about lice on Shabbos, but he adds an extra twist. He says, l'chayra, this whole achreinim are saying, you can't see the lice until they're born. It's not true. The eggs of the lice are called nits, right? You have someone that has lice in their hair, so you're looking for a lice, you're looking for nits. Obviously, the nits are visible. So why are we saying that that whole process is not visible? She says, Elamai, until the magnifying glass was invented, it didn't occur to anybody that these nits are really beitzei kinim. It looks like dirt. The only way we know that these are the eggs is through the magnifying glass. So that alone, so that this is a nice illustration of this vart, that even if it is somewhat visible, but if you need the magnifying glass to complete the picture, and in Bahar Daya we see that until that was invented, it never occurred to anybody to make the connection, so that means that the halacha doesn't actually count as visible. So now, if Oberlander gets to the question of the shrotzim in the water, so he says, l'chayra, you could see something in the water, but l'chayra just looks like a speck, dirt, random detritus in the water. It doesn't look like bugs. Even if you're looking under electric lights. That they're telling us in 2004 that they've been in the water already for many years. And no one noticed it. Whoever it was that discovered it. You need a magnifying glass. This is what it seemed to me, he says, when I checked in Williamsburg. So we could have a whole discussion. Maybe it's not even awesome. But then I heard that in a bar park, they could see it. So in bar park, they look like Teilayim, even to the average eye. True, you need extra effort and under electric lights, but that's what they're saying, that they see it.
What's after the child possession and these things are only in New York City and not in other cities?
I certainly wasn't planning on getting into right now, and we're 4 minutes left, so we're not really getting into the water. There's the whole discussion of the water and the source of the water. That's its own discussion for another time. So, and another vert that they say is that the reason why you can't see them so well is because they're already dead. The chlorine already killed them. But if you would see them originally in their original state, you would see that they're there and they're squirming and they're crawling, and it would be neder leinayim, according to Shlomo Zalman's definition there. So now, That's how he presents it. So in the end, he ended up in lahachim b'zeh klal, and then he continues to the next issue. Now, if you look at Rabbi Heller, so he starts off also in this Indian, and he brings some Shulchan Aruch that the gather in Shratzim is that it's not a sheretz, kol zman shalei richashu. So it's the crawling, but there's another opinion in Rishayim that goes a little further. Af b'chayes ba'alma afilu b'lei richush. So as long as you can see that it's alive, even if it's not literally crawling. And that's not even referring to visible. That's just a gather in sheretz hashayretz. But now Rav Heller comes and combines these two things and says that the same way when it comes to the etzim sheretz parts, it has to be a visible sheretz. So Avad, the same thing goes for the sheretz part, that the chayas, the rechisha, also has to be visible, or else that doesn't count as chayas and rechisha. That fits in very nicely with what the Shevet HaLevi said about the thousands of dots, and even Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, who originally said that you have to be mavchin b'chayusan and b'rechishasan, and now the shaila just is b'mitzias with the citrus fruits, what's actually going on with them, and that's why some were machmir more there. He says there's a whole discussion about miyat hamatzui, which is also for different time. So in the Shas HaTshuvas Beis Ephraim, he says that even when you check when there's a miyat hamatzui, that's when you have to check. That's only if there are vadei shratzim. And now you just don't know if those vadei shratzim are here or not, so now you're checking to see if the miyat hamatzui is present over here. But if the thing itself is a suffix sheretz, not a vadei sheretz, so then we say sveika l'kula. And Rav Heller says that's often a taz in Simon Pedal, which is about the shratzim and the water and the peiros and everything. It says in Sifches that kol minei peiros shedarkim lasliya b'mechubar, that they're wormy while they're attached, so that's much worse. So Zokataz mashma that if it's only masliya betalosh, ein sarach bedika. The Shulchan Aruch that you need bedika if it's bebechover. That means you don't need bedika when it's betalosh. So you don't have to check the flour, you don't have to check the raisins to see if there's bugs there. This is only an isser after they're a pirish. So it's a svek sveka. Why should you assume that they're a pirish already? So what do you see the Taz is saying? The Taz is essentially saying because you have a suffix if it was pirish or not, and it's only a problem after it was pirish. So therefore you don't have to check. So over here, we also have a suffix. There the suffix was if it was pirish. Here the suffix is it large enough, is it visible enough that when it moves, you see it? Or maybe you even have both svekas. Maybe you have a suffix also if it was pirish in the water. So, and this is the Gangi actually wants to go with the halacha. So he concludes this section of his discussion. On the kudus ktanes shleinir behem zulas v'yidei schuchas megadeles loy tzuras telas v'loy shum chayas. It doesn't mean that he's saying that that's the category for these bugs in the water, but that's the first point that he established. And we're going to have to be mamshech another time to the additional points to be built on top of that. And for now, have a good chance.